There is a restaurant in Moab, Utah, perched on a red rock cliff several hundred feet above the valley floor, where you can eat a $38 prime rib in the living room of a man who died broke. His name was Charlie Steen. In the 1950s, he was the richest man in Utah. He built this house for $250,000, greenhouse, servants' quarters, the largest swimming pool in the state. And from its windows, he could look down on a town of fewer than 5,000 people that existed in large part because of him. Today, 2 million travelers a year crane their necks upward from the highway to glimpse that same house, which is now called the Sunset Grill. They are driving to Arches National Park, or Canyonlands, or the Slick Rock Trail, or one of the 40-odd hotels and motels lining a main street that a generation ago had almost none. The view from the Steen mansion has not changed. The La Salle Mountains still rise to 12,500 feet to the east. The Colorado River still bends through the valley below. But everything between the river and the mountains has been remade 3 times over, each time by the same pattern. A resource is discovered, a rush follows, the town is transformed, the resource is exhausted, and what's left behind takes decades to clean up. The only thing that changes is what they're mining. Moab sits in a valley 15 miles long and 3 miles wide on the Colorado Plateau. And for most of its history, it was extraordinarily difficult to reach. The nearest railroad stop at Thompson Springs was 35 miles away over rough country. The first bridge across the Colorado River was not completed until 1912. Before that, there was a ferry, one ferry, and before that, there was nothing but a river crossing that the Spanish explorer Juan Maria Antonio de Rivera had noted in 1765, and the Sabuagana Utes had used for centuries before him. The Mormons tried to settle the valley in 1855. 40 men arrived in June under the banner of the Elk Mountain Mission, built a stone fort, planted crops in the tall grasslands along the river, and began trading weapons and ammunition with local Utes. It did not take long for the relationship to collapse. The settlers had built their fort and dug their furrows in the grasslands the Utes depended upon for food and hunting. Armed conflicts broke out. 3 settlers were killed. By late September of that same year, the surviving missionaries retreated to Sanpete Valley, and the Elk Mountain Mission became the first failure of religion-directed settlement in the entire history of Utah. For more than 20 years, nobody tried again. Then, in 1878, permanent settlers returned, ranchers, farmers, and fruit growers. By the turn of the century, Moab had become one of Utah's finest orchard regions, producing peaches, apples, and grapes. A local newspaper, the Grand Valley Times, started promoting the area's scenic attractions as early as 1906. And in 1909, a Moab Commercial Club was organized to advertise the region. But the scenery did not yet have a name that mattered. What it had, when anyone bothered to describe the land at all, was emptiness. The town needed a name before it could get a post office. A committee was formed. William Pierce, a local farmer and occasionally a dentist, suggested Moab. In its biblical reference, Moab was a dry, sandy wilderness. The name fit. Pierce became the first postmaster. For the next 50 years, the town grew slowly. A Mormon ward and a school in 1881. The county seat designation in 1890, when Grand County was carved from portions of Emery and Uinta counties. Incorporation as a town in January 1903. Construction of the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad between Denver and Salt Lake City had brought a rail connection as close as Thompson Springs, 35 miles north. Close enough for commerce, far enough to keep Moab isolated. A ferry across the Colorado operated by 1885, but the first steel bridge did not arrive until 1912. Moab became one of Utah's finest fruit-growing areas, peaches, apples, grapes, and the orchards gave the valley a pastoral economy that could sustain a few hundred families, but would never make anyone rich. By 1929, the federal government designated the landscape just north of town as Arches National Monument, recognizing the highest concentration of natural sandstone arches on Earth. More than 2,000 of them, sculpted by wind and ice, from 300-million-year-old Navajo sandstone above an underground salt bed. It was spectacular. Almost nobody came. The Great Depression and then the war kept visitors away, and the roads into the monument were unpaved, rough, and discouraging. Even after the war, Arches remained a place that existed more on maps than in the public consciousness. In 1950, the population of Moab stood at 1,275 people. Then, a broke geologist from Texas changed everything. Charlie Steen was born in Caddo, Texas in 1919. He studied geology at the Texas College of Mines, worked prospects in Bolivia and Peru during the war, married a woman named Minnie Lee Holland, and by the early 1950s had arrived at a theory that the professional geology establishment considered borderline insane. Uranium, Steen believed, could be found in a geological formation, the Chinle, that nobody had previously considered worth exploring. The established geologists wanted nothing to do with the idea. Neither did the money men. Steen's folly, they called it. What Steen did have was timing. The Cold War had made the United States government frantic for a domestic uranium supply. The Atomic Energy Commission, the only legal purchaser of the ore, had established minimum prices, guaranteed rates for 10 years, and was offering a $10,000 bonus for every new high-grade discovery. School teachers, insurance brokers, used car salesmen, and shoe clerks converged on the Colorado Plateau with Geiger counters in hand. Steen was just one of them, except that he had a geology degree, a stubbornness that bordered on pathological, and $1,000 borrowed from his mother. He moved his pregnant wife and 3 children to a tar paper shack in the ghost settlement of Cisco, Utah, about 40 miles north of Moab. They had no running water. Minnie Lee washed clothes on a washboard in the river. For 2 years, Steen drilled and found nothing. The locals mocked him. His family was nearly destitute. And then on July 6, 1952, it happened. Steen had broken his drill bit at 180 feet and pulled up the rig. He drove into town for supplies, his Jeep loaded with core samples taken from higher up the borehole, samples he hadn't even bothered to test. At a gas station, the attendant walked up with a Geiger counter. The needle went wild. Steen had struck the largest deposit of high-grade uranium ore ever found in the United States. His Mi Vida mine, My Life, shipped $1 million worth of ore in its first 6 months. The ore assayed at up to 87% uranium. Within 2 years, 7 million shares of uranium penny stocks were trading in a single day in Salt Lake City, and the population of Moab had begun a climb that would take it from 1,275 to 4,682 in a single decade. The money came faster than the town could absorb it. New motels went up along the highway, new cafes, new stores, new schools. Prospectors and speculators poured in. By 1956, the red buttes and mesas around Moab were producing 95% of the nation's uranium ore. A magazine article from that year described the transformation in stark terms. 4 years earlier, Moab had been a sleepy farming village 35 miles from a railroad and 135 miles from a recognized airport. Now it was the uranium capital of the world. Steen himself was the embodiment of the boom. He built the $8 million uranium reduction company mill just outside town, the nation's largest privately owned uranium processing facility, employing more than 200 workers. He built his hilltop mansion and threw annual parties in a local airport hangar, inviting the entire population of Moab. He had his worn-out prospecting boots cast in bronze. He flew to Salt Lake City in his private plane for weekly rumba lessons. Because television reception in Moab was poor, he put a television in his airplane and flew circles over the valley so his family could watch their favorite shows. He donated $50,000 to the local hospital. He gave land for schools and churches. He built a housing subdivision below his mansion, Steenville, and offered his employees low-interest mortgages. Henry Fonda stopped by for parties when he was shooting films nearby. There was, reportedly, an episode of I Love Lucy in which Lucy tries to get Ricky to join her in the hunt for uranium. The whole country had Moab fever. Steen was not the only one striking it rich. A Texan named Blanton Burford and his partners sliced into an 8-foot vein of high-grade ore while bulldozing a road into their claims on Rattlesnake Mountain. A group of high school students staked 40 claims and later sold them for $15,000. By the mid-1950s, nearly 600 producers on the Colorado Plateau were shipping uranium ore, and employment in the mines and mills topped 8,000 workers. In May of 1954, the penny stock frenzy in Salt Lake City reached its frenzied peak. Over 7 million shares traded in a single day, most of them in companies whose primary assets were little more than a claim marker in the desert and a hopeful name. The scramble for wealth, coupled with the low price of shares and the inexperience of many brokers, created what one historian called a most unstable marketplace. But in Moab, the money felt real. It was real. Uranium in its purest state was worth 35 times as much as gold, and the red buttes around Moab contained more of it than anywhere else in the country. What makes the Steen story more than a colorful anecdote is what was happening at the exact same time, 4 miles north of town, that almost nobody noticed. In April of 1956, the same year Steen's mill opened, a young writer from Pennsylvania named Edward Abbey reported for duty as a seasonal park ranger at Arches National Monument. He lived in a government-issued trailer. He maintained trails, greeted the handful of visitors who showed up, and explored a landscape that was still, functionally, wilderness. There were no paved roads into the monument. There were almost no people. Abbey would later describe the experience in a book published in 1968 titled Desert Solitaire, whose opening line would become famous. "This is the most beautiful place on earth." The book was a love letter to solitude and a furious warning against what Abbey called industrial tourism, the paving, the parking lots, the conversion of wild places into scenic drives for people who would never leave their cars. He was writing about a park that, the year he worked there, attracted visitors in the low thousands. So picture it. In 1956, Charlie Steen is on his hilltop hosting parties for celebrities, watching his uranium mill process the most sought-after mineral on the planet. And Edward Abbey is alone in a trailer 4 miles away, watching the sun move across sandstone arches in absolute silence. The richest man in Moab and its most articulate future prophet, occupying the same valley at the same moment, seeing entirely different things. It would take decades for Abbey's vision to matter more than Steen's, but it would. The first cracks in Steen's empire appeared by the late 1950s. The federal government, it turned out, had been buying more uranium than it needed. The Atomic Energy Commission had stockpiled enough, and the guaranteed prices that had launched the boom began to evaporate. Steen was elected to the Utah State Senate in 1958, but he quickly collided with Utah's political culture. He introduced bills to reform the state's liquor laws, specifically to allow Utahns to purchase liquor by the drink. This was, after all, Utah. The bills went nowhere. Frustrated, disillusioned, and increasingly uncomfortable being the only millionaire in a town of 5,000, Steen resigned from the Senate in 1961 and moved his family to a ranch outside Reno, Nevada. He told a writer for Cosmopolitan, "What I liked best about Nevada was the protective coloration. In Moab, I was the only millionaire." The mansion on the hill went dark. Steen sold the mining company and the mill to Floyd Odlum's Atlas Corporation in 1962. He invested his remaining fortune in ventures that read like a parody of diversification. Arabian horse breeding, a marble quarry, an executive airplane factory, a pickle plant, real estate. Every one of them failed. In 1968, the Internal Revenue Service seized his assets. He had paid, by his own account, over $30 million in taxes over the years. The IRS said he still owed $4 million. His attorneys claimed the real figure was $482,000, a sum he could have paid to save everything. Instead, the Steens fought for 7 years. In 1975, they gave up. They lost the Reno mansion and most of their remaining property. In 1971, between court dates, Steen had been hit in the head by a drill at a copper prospect in California. He lay in a coma for over a month. 3 brain surgeries brought him back, but he was never quite the same. There was a period when the electricity to the Reno mansion had been shut off, and the family sat eating beans by candlelight. Charlie Steen, who had unlocked over $1 billion worth of uranium from the desert floor, died on New Year's Day, 2006, in Loveland, Colorado, suffering from Alzheimer's disease. He was 86. His family had fractured so badly that one faction kept his death secret from the others. Back in Moab, the town that Steen had built was beginning a long, slow contraction. The uranium market did not collapse all at once. It eroded. The Atomic Energy Commission, having stockpiled enough fissile material to end civilization several times over, stopped supporting the prices that had made prospecting profitable. Some mining continued. Oil production brought a secondary boom in the late 1950s, when 3 producing fields opened near Moab, and that carried into the 1960s. But oil alone could not replace what uranium had been. The one bright spot was potash. There had always been potash beneath the Paradox Basin, up to 2 billion tons of it, according to the United States Geological Survey. In 1963, the Texas Gulf Sulphur Company opened a conventional underground mine at Cane Creek, along the Colorado River about 20 miles west of town, and built a railroad spur from Crescent Junction to haul the product out. But the mine's first year was catastrophic. In August 1963, a gas explosion trapped 25 miners 2,700 feet below the surface. Rescue teams worked frantically for nearly 20 hours before making contact with 2 survivors, Blake Hanna and Paul McKinney, who had waited in the heated darkness of the shaft. McKinney said later, "When we hit the surface that day, well, I can't explain exactly how I felt, but I was damn glad to get to the surface." 5 more miners survived by building makeshift airlocks from curtains to hold back the toxic smoke. 18 men died. The mine was eventually converted to solution mining and solar evaporation, producing the electric blue ponds visible from Dead Horse Point State Park, a site that thousands of tourists now photograph from the overlook without knowing what they are looking at or how many men died in the making of them. Hollywood offered intermittent diversion. John Ford had first brought cameras to the area in 1949 for Wagon Master, employing nearly all of Moab's 1,500 residents as extras and crew. A local rancher named George White founded a film commission to promote the area to studios, and over the following decades, westerns flowed through the valley. Rio Grande in 1950, Warlock in 1959, The Comancheros in 1961, Cheyenne Autumn in 1964. The landscape was the star, as it always would be. Director Ridley Scott, scouting locations years later for Thelma and Louise, reportedly said he had seen more wonderful and varied scenery in a single day in Moab than in any other day he had ever scouted. But film production was seasonal and unpredictable, and it did not employ enough people to sustain a town. The uranium mill had continued operating under Atlas Corporation until 1984, when it ceased operations for good. By then, the real legacy of the boom was not money. It was waste. The mill had accumulated 16 million tons of uranium tailings in an unlined impoundment on the banks of the Colorado River. 16 million tons of radioactive sand, covering 130 acres, sitting 750 feet from the water supply for roughly 40 million people downstream. The tailings contained radium, thorium, and trace heavy metals, retaining up to 85% of the original ore's radioactivity. Ammonia and uranium were leaching into the groundwater and flowing into the river. Atlas declared bankruptcy in 1998, the same corporate playbook that would become familiar to anyone watching the American extractive industries. In 2001, Congress transferred the mess to the Department of Energy. And while the pile sat there, radiating quietly into the river, something else was happening to Moab. It was dying. The population, which had peaked at 5,333 in 1980, dropped to 3,971 by 1990. Houses stood empty. Nearly all the uranium mines had closed. Potash was still being produced at the Cane Creek mine along the Colorado, a mine opened in 1963 by the Texas Gulf Sulphur Company, where, in its first year of operation, an underground explosion had trapped 25 miners 2,700 feet below the surface. 18 of them died. 7 survived by building makeshift airlocks out of curtains to hold back toxic smoke. The mine eventually switched to solution mining and solar evaporation, producing the electric blue ponds still visible from Dead Horse Point State Park. But potash was not enough to sustain a town. Moab needed a new economy. And as Dave Sacrison, who entered local politics in the mid-1980s and would serve as mayor for decades, later recalled, they found one. They just didn't know what it would cost. You got to be careful what you wish for, he said. The rescue came on 2 wheels. In 1983, 1 year before the Atlas uranium mill closed, 2 brothers named Robin and Bill Groff opened a bicycle shop on Main Street called Rimcyclery. They sold 15 mountain bikes that first year. Mountain biking was a new sport, pioneered in the late 1970s in Marin County, California, and Crested Butte, Colorado. Nobody knew yet that the sandstone terrain around Moab was, improbably, the best surface on Earth for the new machines. The Navajo sandstone that the old settlers had called slick rock, named because horses' metal shoes slipped on it, turned out to provide extraordinary grip to rubber tires. You could climb slopes that looked impossible. The rolling dunes of petrified sand northeast of town, already marked since 1969 as a motorcycle trail by the Bureau of Land Management, became the Slick Rock Bike Trail, a 10.5-mile loop that would eventually attract over 100,000 riders a year. In 1985, Mountain Bike magazine launched its first issue, and the editors made a shrewd decision. They put Moab on the cover. Riders on the Slick Rock, red cliffs blazing behind them, blue Utah sky above. It was the same trick John Ford had used when he brought his cameras to the area in 1949 to shoot Wagon Master, employing nearly all of Moab's 1,500 residents as extras. The landscape was the star. The landscape was always the star. And the landscape had a literary champion, too, even if he would have hated what came next. Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire had found a growing audience since its 1968 publication. Readers drawn to its fierce, lyrical defense of wilderness and its rage at the Park Service's plans to pave and develop the very places it was supposed to protect. The irony was total and irreversible. Abbey's book, which argued that the desert should be left alone, became one of the primary reasons people decided to visit. He had described a place so beautiful that the description itself guaranteed the solitude he cherished would be destroyed. The pieces aligned. Arches had been upgraded from National Monument to National Park in 1971. Canyonlands National Park had been established in 1964, with Moab as its northern gateway. River running on the Colorado, which had begun as a tourist activity in the 1950s, had achieved wide popularity by the 1970s, and Moab now boasted numerous outfitters. Then came the mountain bikers. The Slick Rock Trail created a shoulder season that had never existed before. Spring and fall were suddenly as busy as summer, extending the window in which local businesses could stay open and turn a profit. New trails were mapped and marked. The whole Enchilada, Porcupine Rim, Magnificent 7. By the end of the 1980s, Rimcyclery was one of the leading sellers of mountain bikes in the country, and several competitors had opened along Main Street. Then came the hikers and the four-wheelers and the rock climbers and the base jumpers. Hollywood kept coming. Thelma and Louise filmed its iconic final scene at Fossil Point, near Dead Horse Point, in 1990. The Ford Thunderbird sailing off the edge of the canyon into the American cinematic unconscious. That point is now literally identified on Google Maps as Thelma and Louise Point. City Slickers 2 followed in 1994, filmed at Fisher Towers. Later came Westworld, Mission Impossible 2, and Disney's John Carter, which brought a 400-person crew to the desert. Each production reminded millions of viewers that this landscape existed and could be visited. By the 2000s, Moab had completed one of the most dramatic economic pivots of any small town in the American West. The population climbed back above 5,000. Main Street filled with outfitters, gear shops, restaurants, and hotels. Grand County's transient room tax, the tax on overnight accommodations, became one of the largest revenue sources in the region, funding not just tourism promotion, but hospitals, roads, and public safety. In 2023, Arches National Park alone drew 1.5 million visitors who spent an estimated $283 million in the surrounding communities. Canyonlands added another 800,000 visitors and $106 million. The total economic output from the 4 national park units in southeastern Utah topped $486 million in a single year. All of this pouring into a town of 5,366 people. And that is the number that explains everything that went wrong. Because 5,000 people cannot absorb 1.5 million visitors without something breaking. And what broke was the thing that makes a town a town. The ability of the people who work there to live there. By 2021, the median home price in Grand County had reached $584,500, the 4th highest county in the entire state of Utah. Yet incomes in Grand County remained below the state average. The gap was filled by the thing that always fills it in tourist towns, short-term rentals. Homes that had once housed families were converted to Airbnbs and VRBOs. Second home buyers from California and New York arrived with remote work incomes and bid up prices further. The Housing Authority of southeastern Utah started publishing a weekly Facebook post called What's for Rent Wednesday, listing every available rental in the area. There were weeks when the list showed 0. The hospital lost 9 employees in a single year to housing issues. A new auto shop teacher at Grand County High School arrived from Nevada with his wife and 5 children, and 3 days before the move, bought a 27-foot camper because he could not find a house. They lived in it. The city of Moab itself began purchasing housing so that newly hired police officers would have somewhere to sleep. Officers who started at $21.65 an hour in a town where one-bedroom apartments, when they existed at all, rented for $1,800 a month or more. The occupancy rate for available rentals hovered near 99%. Longtime residents coined a term for what happened to the people who came to Moab for jobs and couldn't find housing: the bounce effect. They bounced right back out. Dave Sacrison, the man who had entered local politics during the bust and spent his career promoting tourism as the way out, reflected on the consequences with a candor unusual for elected officials. Moab, he said, was becoming less of a cautionary tale and more of a template, one that other small towns near national parks and scenic land would inevitably replicate. He had watched the transformation from empty storefronts to overflowing parking lots, and he wasn't sure the second condition was better than the first. The former mayor's warning echoed, "Be careful what you wish for." Tourism had saved Moab from the uranium bust. Now tourism was performing its own kind of extraction, not of ore from the ground, but of livability from the town itself. The service workers who poured coffee and guided rafts and cleaned hotel rooms were competing for housing against visitors who were willing to pay more per night than those workers earned in a day. It was an economy that ran on the labor of people it could not afford to shelter. The pressures mounted. Arches, the park that drew the biggest crowds, saw its annual visitation surge 74% between 2011 and 2021, peaking at over 1.8 million visitors. Traffic backed up at the entrance gate. The park was temporarily closed on busy days when it simply ran out of room. In 2022, the National Park Service introduced a timed entry reservation system, a pilot program requiring advance tickets during peak months. It worked in a narrow sense. Congestion at the entrance and at popular sites like Delicate Arch and Devil's Garden dropped measurably. But it also reduced visitation by an estimated 14%, roughly 170,000 fewer visitors a year. And those missing visitors were missing dollars. Grand County commissioners, business owners, and tourism board members began arguing bitterly about whether the reservation system was protecting the park or strangling the economy. The debate became a proxy war for a deeper question. What is Moab for? Is it a town where people live, or a staging area for people who are passing through? Can it be both? The Tourism Board's 2026 budget allocated roughly $8 million in transient room tax revenue, with $3.5 million going to promotion. $6 million was spent on the Moab Office of Tourism. Critics asked why the county was spending millions to attract more of the very visitors who were making the town unaffordable for its own residents. Defenders pointed out that without the tourism tax revenue, residents would have to pay for hospitals, roads, and emergency services themselves, and there were not enough of them to cover the bill. Then, in 2025, the visitors started staying away. Grand County had projected a 6% increase in tourism. Instead, it got a 4% decline. International visitors dropped steeply. Flight bookings from Europe to the United States fell 12% over the summer, and the broader trend of declining inbound tourism reduced the flow of European and Asian travelers who had long been a major part of Moab's customer base. Sales tax revenues dipped. Community resort tax collections fell roughly $83,000 in a single month compared to the prior year. Restaurant owners reported unpredictable traffic. The Tourism Board scrambled to launch a rebranding campaign. A board member used a phrase that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. We're losing our relevance. Meanwhile, the timed entry reservation system at Arches was eliminated in February 2026 after pressure from Utah state officials, who had pushed for its removal in a closed-door meeting the previous December, a meeting from which journalists, the public, and even some National Park Service personnel were excluded. The park returned to open entry. Local officials braced for the return of entrance gate gridlock, while simultaneously hoping the increased access would bring more visitors back. And while all of this was happening, the housing crisis, the tourism debate, the political fights over park access, something remarkable was being completed just north of town on the banks of the Colorado River. The pile was finally being moved. Since 2009, the Department of Energy had been excavating the 16 million tons of uranium mill tailings left behind by the Atlas Corporation, loading them into sealed steel containers and shipping them by rail 30 miles north to an engineered disposal cell at Crescent Junction. The same rail spur that Texas Gulf Sulphur had built in 1963 to haul potash was now being used to haul away the radioactive legacy of the uranium age. Roughly 1 million tons were shipped each year, 4 train trips a week for 17 years. In early 2026, the DOE announced that the pile was gone, all 16 million tons. The ceremony drew county and city officials, Department of Energy staff, representatives from Utah's congressional delegation, and the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, the agency representing the 40 million downstream water users whose advocacy had helped secure the funding. Moab's mayor, Joette Langianese, who had worked on the project for more than 25 years, spoke at the event. She recalled being told early on that a town of 10,000 people would never be able to move the needle on a federal cleanup project of this scale. 40 million water users downstream, California, Arizona, Nevada, they're going to move the deal, she had been advised. And they did. The city and the county have requested joint ownership of the 480-acre site. Their plan is to convert it into an outdoor recreational park. There is something in that plan that captures the whole history of Moab in a single gesture. The land where uranium ore was crushed and processed into Cold War fuel, where 16 million tons of radioactive waste leached poison into the river for decades, will become a park. Another attraction, another reason for visitors to come. The cycle does not break, it only changes what's being extracted. In 1992, Moab hosted a 3-day Discovery Days celebration, marking the 40th anniversary of Charlie Steen's Mi Vida strike. Steen was the guest of honor. Former miners and boomtown residents returned. There was a parade on the 4th of July, and someone had tracked down Steen's old Jeep, the one he'd been driving the day the Geiger counter sang at the gas station. They put him in it. A local reporter asked him how it looked. "Looks pretty good to me," Steen said. He was 72. He had already been hit in the head by the drill. The Alzheimer's had not yet been diagnosed, or perhaps it had just begun, quietly, the way these things do. His mansion was by then a restaurant. His mill was a cleanup site. His fortune was gone, distributed in fragments through the courts and the IRS and the failed investments in horses and pickles and airplanes. But the town that his one discovery had conjured into existence was still there, and it was filling up with a new kind of prospector. People who came not to take something from the ground, but to ride across its surface on 2 wheels, to hike its trails, to photograph its arches, to eat dinner in his living room. Up at the Sunset Grill today, there is a 3-foot replica of Charlie Steen's prospecting boots, cast in bronze, on display among other memorabilia from the family's years in the Hilltop house. The dining room looks out over the same valley Steen surveyed when he was worth $100 million, and when he was worth nothing. The tourists who eat there mostly do not know his story. They are in Moab for the parks, for the trails, for the river, for the red rock. They are part of an economy that generates nearly $500 million a year in a county with fewer than 10,000 residents. An economy so dominant that the county's entire economic development department was recently renamed the Moab Office of Tourism, because there is, functionally, no other economy to develop. Down below the mansion on the banks of the Colorado, the ground where the pile sat for 40 years is bare now. The tailings are gone. The cleanup will continue for years. Groundwater remediation, soil testing, monitoring wells, but the visible evidence of the uranium age has been erased. What will grow there eventually is a park, and the tourists will come. They always come. The question Moab has never been able to answer in 148 years of settlement is what happens when they stop.